Did you know that the City of Gainesville receives hundreds of requests each year to inspect or copy the city's public records, and that those requests can be submitted by any person, either orally or in writing? Those requests can come in the mail, by email, through a telephone call, or in person to any city employee, including you. Because of this, every city employee needs to know what to do if he or she receives a request for public records. To begin with, if you do receive such a request, you should just say yes. There are a number of reasons to just say yes. First, while it might seem to be a hassle to stop what you're doing to respond to a public records request, all employees need to realize that this right was deemed important enough to the people of Florida to include it in the state constitution as a basic civil right. That's right. Access to public records is right up there with freedom of speech and the right of privacy and all those other civil rights that we hold so dear. As such, we should treat compliance with the public records law and responding to public records requests as part of our basic duties to serve the public. Here's another way to look at it. The work you do is for and on behalf of the citizens, and they have the right to ask to see it. If we give this right the respect it deserves, you are less likely to be front and center in a public records lawsuit. Over 200 lawsuits have been brought against governmental agencies as well as private businesses who have contracts with governmental agencies in Florida. These allege that employees of those agencies and businesses violated Florida's public records law. In this module, we are going to give you information that will help keep you and the city out of court. You'll learn what we mean when we say, if you get a public records request, just say yes. We'll begin this portion of the module showing you what not to do if you get a public records request.
Okay, I'm here to make a public records request. Do you guys take like complaints for animal cruelty, that kind of stuff?
We do.
Have you had any written complaints filed in the last 2 weeks?
Written complaints?
Yeah. Have you taken any complaints in the last 2 weeks?
We take complaints every day for that's one.
Can I see the records that you have for like the last couple of days?
For everything, or just for a specific location?
Just any. How many do you get in a day? Do you think?
It can vary from 1 to 20, 30, 40.
How many did you get yesterday? You think?
20, 30, 40.
Yesterday? Can I just take a look at the ones you got, the last 3 or 4 you got yesterday?
For something like that, let me
See if he can get more. Okay. Yeah.
Kind of what we can do.
6968. He's going to call the supervisor, because
right.
typically you fill out the public records request, then we email it or give you a hard copy. The hard copy is like, I think, 15 cents a page, and the email's free.
Okay.
But usually it's not every activity for that day, so we just want to see how she handles it. But we'll get it for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you with any company or?
No. Just making a public records request. So I need to fill this out before I go look at the records?
Yeah.
I can't just look at them by making a verbal request?
No. Put your name here, your street address, your city, state, zip, phone number, a brief description of everything that you want.
It doesn't matter any car.
Some more detail.
Yeah.
Like, I want
Do you find out what you
animal
want?
control complaints.
Okay. But you guys have the records here, right?
Yeah.
Are they hard to get at?
No, all you have to do is fill out one of these, fill it within the next 24 to 48 hours. And your signature right there.
Okay, let me just be sure I'm clear then. So you guys have the records here. They're easily accessible, but I need to fill this out as a condition of getting the records, and then it'll take 24 to 48 hours to produce the records that are easily available.
Correct.
Okay, can I take this with me and then get it back to you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and what was your name?
Andrew.
Andrew. What's your last name?
McCraw.
What? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. Steve Cummings.
I'm just here to make a public records request. I want to
Okay.
inspect your visitor's log for the last couple of days.
And who are you?
Do I have to give you that information to get the records?
Because if you're going to, we've got to know who it is, just so we don't give it to anybody. Some of that stuff is, like I said, got to know why you want it.
So I can't have it unless you...
Unless you go ahead and make a request, and you got to make a request in writing.
The request has to be in writing, and I have to tell you why I want it and who I am.
Mm-hmm. You know, normally this is a media request. That's what it normally is.
Okay.
Are you
all
part
right.
of the media?
Well, I'm not really interested in answering any questions.
Okay. Like I said,
Steve Cummings?
Steve Cummings.
Okay.
Okay. Director of Security for School District. Okay.
All right.
You can understand my concern.
I'm sorry?
You can understand my concern.
No, not really.
You know, it's not getting a word for it. It has to do with security.
So it has to be in writing. I have to tell you who I am and why I want it.
You bet.
Otherwise, I can't get access to the records.
I mean, you can always hire yourself an attorney and go that route. So you can make it difficult, or you can make it easy. It's up to you.
Okay, so as a condition of access, I have to make it in writing.
Yes.
I have to tell you who I am and why I want the records.
Exactly.
The alternative is hiring an attorney.
Exactly right.
Have a good day.
Let's start by making sure you know what to do to avoid problems when you get a public records request. Let's start by clarifying what a public records request is. It's a request submitted to any city employee by any person, either orally or in writing, to inspect or copy the city's public records. Florida law dictates how we need to respond to such requests, and if we don't respond properly, the City of Gainesville could be fined or sued. So what is a public record? According to the Florida Supreme Court, a public record is any material prepared in connection with official agency business which is intended to perpetuate, communicate, or formalize knowledge of some type. Aside from paper files and documents, computer records, emails, Facebook entries, tape recordings, text messages, and instant messages are public records when they are made or received by a city employee in connection with official city business and are used to perpetuate, communicate, or formalize knowledge. We've already said that the law allows any person to inspect public records or to request copies. It's also important for you to know that the request doesn't have to be in writing. You cannot ask for a reason the request is being made, nor can you require the person to give his or her name or any other personal information, or require them to sign for a receipt of the records. When you get a request to inspect or copy a public record, the first thing you should do is say yes. And by that we mean you should promptly acknowledge the request and then promptly respond to the request in good faith. In other words, be helpful and let the person know what you will do to fulfill their request. If you are the custodian of the record being requested, you are obligated to permit the requested records to be inspected and copied by any person desiring to do so at any reasonable time, under reasonable conditions, and under supervision by the custodian or designee of the public records. Each city employee is considered the custodian of any public record under his or her supervision and control. As the custodian of those public records, you are responsible for retaining and then furnishing them if a request for those records is made. It is important to note that you are responsible for those records that you create, those that you receive, and for those in your custody when you come into a position. Here are some examples of specific records that could be requested. A request can include email, so it's important to remember that every email you send or receive through the city system, even those you might delete, are accessible by IT. They are also subject to review by IT and your manager, and they could become part of a public record request. It's also important that you familiarize yourself with the city's policies regarding email and use of the Internet. The retention schedule contains a category of records called transitory messages. Many emails will fall into this category. These are records that are created primarily to communicate information of short-term value. Common examples would be the scheduling of meetings and appointments, reminder notices, announcements of office events, and telephone messages. Transitory messages should be retained until obsolete, superseded, or their administrative value is lost. It's important to emphasize that transitory refers to short-term value based on content and purpose of the message, not the format or technology used to transmit it. So, although the record that needs to be retained could be on paper, it could also be an electronic document, an email, voicemail, or even a text message. And this brings us to another important piece of information. Many city employees perform their job functions through the use of numerous electronic devices and systems. Aside from computers, these employees may be equipped with mobile handheld devices on which they can access their city email, send and receive text messages, access the Internet, and receive voicemails. In addition, some employees may use instant messaging, chat rooms, social networking pages, or other Internet-based tools to accomplish their job functions. If public records are created or received on such devices and systems, city employees are required to retain those records in accordance with Florida's public records law, which means that all devices and systems used to conduct city business must have the capability to retain public records that are created or received. So, if a city employee's mobile handheld device is unable to retain copies of text messages in accordance with the state retention schedule so that they are available for inspection and copying, the city employee is prohibited from using the text messaging function to conduct city business. City employees are prohibited from conducting city business on personal computers other than through the use of a VPN or virtual private network connection to the city's network or webmail. Employees are prohibited from downloading city information or data onto their personal computers or other personal electronic devices or systems. Why is that? The main reason for this is IT backs up the system, reducing the risk of losing any data or any public records. GRU Administrative Guideline 1.2 allows managers to authorize the payment of a stipend to employees in positions exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. That would be managers, administrative, and professional employees, those we call MAPs. Employees receiving a stipend are responsible for retaining phone account records for all calls associated with official city business for 3 years. Since text messages are not capable of maintaining a record of the exchange, text messages associated with official city business which are subject to the public records law need to be saved elsewhere for record keeping. Which brings us back to the responsibility of retaining public records. Remember, each city employee who has public records in his or her custody must retain such records in accordance with the records retention schedules established by the Florida Department of State. Violations of the law can result in fines and/or lawsuits. So to ensure that you are in compliance with the state requirements, please visit the Florida Department of State Library and Archives website. GRU Administrative Guideline 5.3 covers destruction of records. This can be found on GrouperNet under the Administrative drop-down box as Administrative Guidelines. Once you receive a request, here are the 4 steps you will need to follow. Promptly acknowledge the request, compute charges and obtain payment, review and redact, and finally you will provide copies or access for inspection, depending on the nature of the request. First, you want to acknowledge promptly. When you get a request, you should always acknowledge it promptly and fulfill it immediately if possible. But if, for instance, the request comes at the end of the day when your office is closing and will take you some time to get the requested information together, you could ask the person making the request to come back during regular operating hours. You are also not required to create new public records in response to a public records request or reformat the city's public records. The next step is to compute charges and obtain payment. Depending on the record being requested and the amount of time and resources it will take to secure the record, the person making the request may be responsible for certain charges. You will need to compute those charges and collect them from the requester before securing the record or making copies. There are two charges you will need to compute, one for copying and one for the time and resources it takes to secure the record. If you are being asked to make copies, the first 10 are free. Otherwise, you will charge for copies based on this chart, which is located on the Human Resources Intranet site under Policies. Look under Policy G5, Administrative Procedure. You may also need to compute the charge for time and resources. This is called a special service charge. This charge will be applied if it will take more than 15 minutes to locate, review for exempt or confidential information, copy, and refile the requested material. Again, you will need to compute and collect this charge prior to securing the record. You compute the special service charge by estimating the amount of time and resources it will take to secure the record to the nearest quarter of an hour. You will then multiply that number by the current hourly rate of pay and benefits for the person who will perform the service. As an example, let's say that you estimate that it will take 25 minutes to locate, review for exempt or confidential information, copy, and refile a requested record. The nearest quarter of an hour would be 30 minutes or half an hour. Let's say the rate of pay and benefits for the person who will perform the service is $20 an hour. The special service charge would be $20 times half an hour equals $10. Remember, you calculate copy cost, determine any special service charges, add those two together, and present the requester with that information and collect all appropriate charges prior to securing the requested documents. Whether the requester is asking for copies or simply to review a record, you will need to take a critical step before you let the requester see any document. In this step, you'll review and redact the record. Redact means to conceal from a copy of an original public record or to conceal from an electronic image that is available for public viewing that portion of the record containing exempt or confidential information. Florida law contains numerous exemptions from inspection or copying of public records. For instance, Social Security numbers of all city employees are exempt from disclosure, as are the home addresses, telephone numbers, and photographs of law enforcement personnel, firefighters, human resources managers, and code enforcement officers. Video recordings from surveillance cameras are also exempt and should not be released in a public records request. Florida law also provides that certain public records are confidential. For example, city employee medical records are confidential. So if a record is confidential, city employees shall not disclose any of the entire record unless the disclosure of such a record to certain entities or persons is permissible by law. If requested by the person seeking to inspect or copy the record, you will need to state specifically and in writing why any part of the record is exempt from the public records law. Since there are over 1,000 exemptions throughout Florida statutes, the Government in the Sunshine Manual and the First Amendment Foundation's exemption database are helpful tools to identify exemptions. Once redaction is completed, you will be able to provide copies or access for inspection. If you are providing access to records for inspection, records should be viewed under the supervision of the custodian of the records or his or her designee when appropriate. This means someone should be present at all times when an individual is reviewing the records to assure that the documents are neither removed, destroyed, or altered. Otherwise, you will make arrangements to provide copies to the requester. GRU Administrative Guideline 5.3, Section 3, Number 6, Viewing of Records Notification, says notification must be sent to legal services stating that an individual requested, viewed, and if applicable, copied records in this manner. So these are the steps to follow when fulfilling a public records request. Number 1, acknowledge promptly. 2, compute charges and obtain payment. 3, review and redact. And 4, provide copies or access for inspection. But what if you are not the custodian of a public record being requested? Then a good faith response includes making reasonable efforts to determine from other departments or employees whether such a record exists, and if so, the location at which the record can be accessed. Again, always keep in mind to be respectful and helpful. Don't hesitate to ask your manager for more detailed information on how to respond to public record requests in your work area. You can also call Sean McDermott and he will be able to answer your questions regarding public records. And be sure to read the City of Gainesville Public Records Policy and Procedure. Before we wrap up the module, let's review what we've learned. We defined a public record as any material prepared in connection with official agency business which is intended to perpetuate, communicate, or formalize knowledge of some type. And we noted that aside from paper files and documents, computer records, emails, Facebook entries, tape recordings, text messages, voicemails, and instant messages are public records when they are made or received by a city employee in connection with official city business and are used to perpetuate, communicate, or formalize knowledge. We reviewed the two major responsibilities you have as a custodian, retaining records and fulfilling public records requests, and established the fact that you are the custodian not only of the public records you create and receive, but all the records that are in your custody when you come into a position. We covered the steps you'll need to take to fulfill a public records request, which included a discussion on the circumstances that would require you to calculate charges and obtain payment from the requester before you gathered the requested record. This concludes Just Say Yes to a Public Records Request. Thank you.